All right, so today what we're gonna do is take a look at lesson 13, which is working with effects. Again, like more just kind of like bells and whistles stuff that you can add onto your illustration. So we'll take a look at working through that, and then we're gonna take a look at the first project where you're gonna be building custom icons. This is kind of a part one of part two, so I'm gonna talk you guys through kind of the whole process. It generally makes a little bit more sense in terms of context if you look at it like bigger picture. You're gonna build icons this week to actually use them for the follow-up project. So I'll kind of talk you through what all that looks like, and we'll kind of take a little bit of a look at workflow and kind of process for that. So first thing I want to do though is I want to quick jump into Blackboard and take a look at what we're going to be doing. So again, we're starting with lesson 13. All of this stuff is here for you guys. So if you want to take a look, the start file is right there. If you pull it open, it looks something like this. There's also this is last year's version of the demo. And then also keep in mind, this is our final lesson that we're going to do as far as a walkthrough. After this, we're going to be focusing only on this projects tab, and we'll take a look at that once we're done with today's demo. So again, if you guys have any questions as you're working, feel free to ask away, or if you want to fire away a question in the chat, that also works. What we're going to be looking at first today is just kind of some basics of effects. So we'll take a look at working with the appearance panel and kind of what appearance attributes are. We'll take a look at different types of effects and how you can apply them and then edit them once you have them applied. And then last thing we're going to take a look at is something called graphic styles. And graphic styles are basically like when you create a bunch of different kind of properties for something. So like strokes, fills, effects, whatever, that you can actually create them and then save them to apply them to multiple pieces later. So if you have kind of a lot of different things stacked together, that you can almost like recycle or reuse them. So first thing I'm doing is pulling this open. If you pulled yours open and you had any issues with your font, please make sure that you have Creative Cloud open and active. There may be a question you'll have about linking fonts. If it does pop open and your fonts aren't there, remember you can always hit this activate fonts because this document does use fonts that are part of the Adobe font collection. So if you do run into that error, just gonna make sure that you're set to go with that. Now, next thing I want to take a look at is what the appearance panel is. So first I'm going to do is go up to make my screen nice and big so you can see all of this. What I want to do is go through my window menu and then down to appearance. And this is the guy I'm looking for. If you're looking for the icon, if you're going to dock this thing over here, it's like almost like a little sunshine kind of looking thing. And what this does, if I pull it away to see all of it, is it's going to show me all the different properties for any object that I have selected. So let's say I grab this background. It's going to show me my stroke, my fill, and then I have an effect turned on, a drop shadow here. And notice these all act almost like clickable links. So I can go in and I can adjust any of these as I see fit. Keep in mind too, on the appearance panel, we've got this little hamburger icon so we can add additional fills or strokes. We can just clear it or set it to a basic appearance. There's also these same buttons here to add a new stroke, add a new fill, add an effect. Or here we can always use this to just clear an appearance. Or if you want to delete any part of the appearance, so say I wanted to get rid of this, I could drag my drop shadow to this trash can and delete it out as well. So this appearance panel is actually really nice. I like to keep a copy of this open as I'm working, just because I think this is kind of a faster way to get through into some basic editing stuff. So what I'm going to do first is my stroke I think is okay. What I'm going to do is I want to take a look at my fill. So I select it, it gives me a little drop down option, and I've got this kind of pink background color. I'm going to select that. And now that I'm seeing this, if I click away to kind of take a look, I don't want that stroke on there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this stroke and set this to none. So I think that looks good. I can still see my drop shadow effect. I think that looks pretty good. And what I can also do is I can add multiple strokes or multiple fills onto objects. So what I'm going to do is here I have this fill, right? Now what I want to do is I want to stack things. So last week we took a look at building a pattern and then applying it onto an object. What I want to do now is I want to actually add in a second fill. So here I can add a new stroke or add a new fill. I'm going to add a new fill, and basically what it does is just going to duplicate what I have. But if I click on this drop down, I've got a couple patterns saved in here. I've got this gravel beach, I've got this thing called crosses. So if I click on this, it applies it as that object. But what I need to take a look at is kind of how everything's going to look. So here, if I turn on my fill, and of course I got my object selected, and that's why nothing's happening. Let me try that again. So if my object's selected, I'm going to add in my new fill. I'm going to select it to my pattern. And now if I turn off my eyeball, here's my pattern against nothing with the background. And then here I can kind of see that pattern. If I zoom in a little bit, there it is as kind of a secondary fill. So it's kind of a nice way of adding texture or depth to an object as you're working and stacking on kind of multiple pieces to it. So anytime you're kind of playing with any of your options, any of your layers, just keep in mind that there's multiples you can apply. So we can stack on multiple objects. If you wanted to stack multiple textures to something, if you wanted to play around with maybe a fill and then a gradient on top of it with a lighter opacity, so you can kind of stack these things and build multiple pieces onto your art. Now that we've seen this on the background, what I want to do is I want to take a look at how this is going to work with text. I want to kind of play around with this art show text and add kind of some multiple strokes and multiple fills onto that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this text and I'm just going to highlight it all just so it knows that I'm working with it. And what I want to do is I want to add in a new fill. So just like we did before, I've got this art selected. Here's my appearance panel. And now if I go into my selection tool, notice kind of doing something a little bit weird here. Now, if I double click on it, as I'm selecting, it's showing me the appearance property. This is for edit mode. Now, if I select it here, what I've got is all my options. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new fill. And what it does is now it converts it into this kind of adjustment format, right? It takes it out of that text mode. So my fill, I'll set it to that yellow. I'm going to make another fill. I'm going to set it to this gravel beach. I want to see that kind of text over the top of it. Now keep in mind too with this that I don't have to see this at full opacity, right? So here where I've got my fills, if I click on this little drop down arrow, I can adjust that opacity. So I can take this and I can slide this down because maybe I don't want that quite so dark. I want to kind of knock that back a little bit. So I think 50% might be good. I may even go a little bit more subtle than that. I just want to get a little kind of texture to it, but I don't want it to be so overwhelming that it kind of dominates. Now I've got a stroke, right? It's set to none. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set this stroke first to a color. I've got this kind of blue. And for my size, I'm going to bump this up, maybe go around about 5 points. Now keep in mind you can stack multiple strokes here. So what I've done is I've got one stroke. I've got this blue set to 5 points. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another one. I'll add a new stroke. And now I've got this other one. And with this top row, this top stroke selected, I'm going to set my color to white. Now notice though, I can't see that area behind it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn this down a little bit. And now you can see I can almost stack. It almost acts like a neon effect. So there's a couple of different things I can do with this. But for right now, I'm going to do kind of a little bit of a different effect. I just want like a little halo look to this right now. So I'm going to set my stroke to 3 just so I can kind of see those. And again, I'm only at 40%. If I zoom into 100%, I can see a little bit more clearly what that's doing. So here we can stack multiples and then play with those stroke sizes to change the reveal on that. So far so good, making sense? All right, now next thing I want to do is I want to take a look at applying some of these different effects. So now we've seen this appearance panel and kind of what it does. And we also know that as we select things, it kind of shows up in this area as an option. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can see the whole thing. Now we saw earlier that there was like this kind of shadow effect here on this box. I want to apply that to other things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this handle here, and this is all grouped together as one big object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start applying some effects to this. So with this selected, there's a couple different ways that I can do this. I have this object selected and it's just one big group. It's telling me that right here. So I can apply my effects 2 ways. I can either go to my effects menu and notice I got 2 different styles. We've got these Illustrator effects and we've seen some of this stuff before. This is really more about adjusting or playing around with the actual vector points. And then we've got these Photoshop effects. And these are going to be more about kind of adding like texture to things. So what I want to do is underneath stylize, this is kind of more of a default one. I'm going to add in a drop shadow. So again, I can go to effect stylize drop shadow, or if my object selected on my appearance panel, pulls up that exact same stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop this open. I always want to make sure this preview box is checked. I'm going to take a look at my settings here. So first thing there is this mode. This is going to control how it interacts with other colors. Multiply will kind of darken against backgrounds. That's really good for a drop shadow. I'm going to stick with that. My opacity, I always want to turn that down. I think one of the big mistakes like younger graphic designers or people new to the profession make is they see these settings and they just click OK to the default. These tend to be like a little exaggerated so you can see what they look like. You always want to kind of turn these down a little bit. So here with my offset, I can kind of control how far off it goes. So maybe I'm going to set this to about 1/8 of an inch in either direction. And then for my blur, I can change that amount too. So what I like to do is I like to turn my blur up a little bit, and I like to turn my opacity down. The more you can see a shadow, the more kind of, I think, a little too obvious it gets and a little too kind of overpowering. I tend to be as subtle as possible with these. So here, it's there. It's just not super dominant. And I think that looks pretty good. But again, I'll leave this up to you guys to decide. Just keep in mind, whenever you're playing with these effects, less is usually more. So I think that looks pretty good. Now, once I apply this effect, keep in mind that it is now available up here as something I can go back in and edit. So here it is. I can select it again. It brings me right back to this menu, and I think that looks good. Now, got that applied. I want to apply that effect to a couple other things too. I want to take a look at adding a drop shadow onto my art show layer too. So just kind of keep some consistency with this. I'll apply my shadow. Notice it keeps all those settings. I'm going to turn my blur down a little bit. And I'm going to turn my opacity down a little bit. I want it to be just a little bit softer in here. I just want to give it a little bit of depth. And I think that how soft it is against that kind of white background, I'm going to get a ton of contrast anyways. So the more contrast I'm naturally getting from the color combination, the less I need to use that effect. So I think that looks good. Now, next thing I want to do is I want to make this text kind of warp into this shape a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my text, and I'm going to throw a warp effect onto this. So with it selected, I'm going to come back into my appearance panel, and I've got a whole warp submenu. And there's a bunch of different ones that I can try here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on one, and it pops open a box and gives me a little preview, right? Now, all those ones in that menu, they're all here. So I think it's a little bit easier to just throw on arc right away, because when you see the pull down here, it actually shows you a little bit of a kind of a little preview of what it's going to look like. So I've got multiple lines, and it's going to kind of follow this like low to high thing. So I think this rise is probably going to work pretty well here. All I need to do now is adjust kind of my amount to make it fit nicely in there. So right around 16 or so, that worked really well. Kind of fits naturally inside of there. My bend looks good. Spacing, I'm happy with all that. So I can click OK. And again, once I have an appearance applied, it's not stuck there forever. I can always jump back in here, and I'm starting to see I got quite a bit of stuff, right? I have strokes, I have multiple fills, I've got a drop shadow, I've got a warp, so I've got a lot of stuff happening on this. And again, if I need to adjust any of it, I can come right back in this appearance panel to make that adjustment. So far, so good, making sense? All right, now what I want to do is I want to take a look at applying kind of some other effect stuff. I've had like some varying success with this offset path thing, but I want to show you guys. I think it's kind of fun. What I'm going to do is with this top banner, got this thing selected. Notice I've got a stroke, I've got a fill, and not a whole lot to it. What I want to do is I want to apply something called an offset path to it. So with this selected, I'm going to come down to my effects button. I'm going to go to path, and then there's this thing called offset path. Now what this does is this is going to kind of push that art around a little bit to kind of rearrange and adjust that stroke. So with that, I'm going to set my offset in the negative. I'm going to set it to minus, I don't know, let's call it 0.15. Now what it does is it takes that path and it kind of pulls it in. Now remember here, this plus or this minus, that makes a difference. That controls it. Now, if you want to see what it's doing, take a look at the edge. This is either pushing out off that edge or subtracting in off that edge and pulling off that path. Now it's kind of giving me that little extra space in there. And then I can kind of control how that'll look and how that'll kind of pull in. So if I wanted to kind of like tighten in that area, because now I can kind of see that edge, that's what that's going to let me control. Now what I want to do next is I want to take a look at, once this is applied, we've got kind of some basic settings here. What we're going to be able to do is actually copy all these settings and apply them, because if you notice, my top banner doesn't match my bottom banner. Well, we're going to have to do something about that. So what we're going to do is take a look underneath Window. There's a thing called graphic styles, and we're going to play around with these graphic styles here. Now, there's a couple different things. There's some pre-built stuff, and then there's a whole library of graphic styles. So what I want to take a look at is, first, taking a look at how we can apply a graphic style on there. Now, again, there's some default ones in here, but what I want to take a look at is this little library at the bottom to load in all the different versions that they have, right? So I'm going to take a look at Illuminate styles, and let's see what these look like. Now, you see how I've got this kind of handle for this paintbrush? It's just white in here, and what I want to do is I want to apply kind of like a metal texture to it. If you take a look, this Illuminate, it's got all these different kind of sheen looks to them. So if you kind of take a look, there's a tin highlight, aluminum, steel, there's that kind of all these different ones. I'll let you guys choose which one you like. I think chrome might be a little bit too much, but I think steel might work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this box. I'm going to click on this steel highlight, and then it applies it on there. Now take a look. It shows me all the different properties for this thing. I've got multiple fills, multiple strokes. That's how that appearance works. So instead of you having to go in and add all these different strokes, all these different fills, it just saves them all as one kind of pre-built style. So I can click away to deselect, and then keep in mind, it builds this as a graphic style. Now I can do this with other things as well. I can select this object right here, and if I want, I could actually define this as a style as well. So I could copy it onto other elements in my artboard. So with this thing selected, I'm gonna hit this little plus button. I'm gonna make a new graphic style, and it just bases it off of whatever you have selected. So here, if I click on this, now it automatically applies my stroke, my fill, my effect. Now it's giving me all the different pieces of that object. So far, so good, making sense? All right, so now that we've taken a look at those, the next thing I want to do is, we kind of spoke earlier about Illustrator and Photoshop effects. Let's take a look at some of these Photoshop effects. I'm going to select this paint here, and it's just kind of like this paint blob. And what I want to do is kind of give this thing a little bit of a texture. I want to actually make it look like paint. So with this selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to my effect menu, and I've got a whole effect gallery. Now you can click through and you can kind of guess what these are going to do, but the effect gallery is going to show you a little preview across all the different styles. And then as I select it, it's going to kind of show me all the different styles of what I can do. What I want to look for is one called sprayed strokes. So we've got all these brush strokes, and I'm trying to make this look like a paintbrush. We might as well use those, right? So I'm going to grab the sprayed strokes, and it kind of does it, but notice I've got all these different settings. So here I can play around with the length, the radius, kind of the amount, the direction. If I want to go vertically, horizontally, how much I want it to go in either direction, how much the length is going to be, less or more. So I can kind of control all these. And again, anytime I see sliders, I just kind of play around with them. Just kind of give myself a sense of what it's doing. And I think that that's kind of giving me a little bit more of a rough edge. So for me, like 19 and 22, I think that looks good. When I click OK, it applies it right on there. It kind of gives me that little bit more of that finished effect. So far, so good. Anything jumping out at you guys? All right, now last thing I'll take a look at is something called scale. Like we've looked at scaling, but what I want to do is I want to take a look at scaling with strokes here. So if you take a look on the bottom left corner here, I got this little building icon, and it's kind of big. It looks like I maybe need to adjust this, but what happens is if I scale this thing down, I want everything to scale proportionally along with it. So I can kind of control all that. So what I'm going to do is, because this is a group, I'm going to double click to select this thing, and I go into isolation mode for it. So I can see I've got all my different pieces to it. If you take a look at this, I've got this stroke, and it's really heavy. It's a 36 point on the outside. So I just want to kind of see what that's doing. Now, as I select these objects, I've got this little, let me pull this out a little bit so I can see all this. I want to just make sure I can read everything here. So again, as we're looking through here, we're going to see all these properties assigned on here. And as we look, we can kind of take a look to play with settings and sizing. Now we've seen that we can use like this scaling tool. So if I double click on this, remember that I've got the scale strokes and effects. So if I want to go smaller, let's say 50%, and I've got that box checked, I just want to make sure that looks all right. I can click OK. And if I take a look here, notice that it scales that stroke down to 18 points. But remember, because I'm in isolation mode, it's only applying to that box. So now if I click out, I'm going to scale this thing. Let's set it to 50%. Now it scales on all these pieces appropriately. I'm going to play with my balance, so my tensions are even along the left side and this point right here. And now if I go back in, double click on this group, I'll see that my scaling is all being even and balanced. So I always want to make sure that as I'm working with effects, I don't want things to scale disproportionately. So if you're moving around with things or you're scaling things up and down, just keep in mind that that scale, strokes, and effects, that's going to be part of this. And again, it scales that effect as well. So if I'm playing with an object that I don't have it selected, this is especially important if I'm doing something like this brush here. If I don't have this scale, strokes, and effects, it leaves the same base of that effect, like my drop shadow here. So if I turn it on and off, you can see it'll scale that along with it. So again, as you're working with things, you always want to make sure that that's selected so that once you build your art, it may not be permanent, but then it's going to give you that as an option as you start creating all those different pieces to it. So that's pretty much it for this lesson. It's really just kind of a matter of taking a look at how you can apply things, multiple fills, multiple strokes, different effects. But again, the big takeaway is just getting comfortable with this appearance panel as well as this graphic styles. I just think that this is a really fast way of editing, especially if you're creating kind of multiple pieces, because then you can define these as elements and they just become a lot easier to work with. So any questions on this? Anything jumping out, you guys? When you're done, you can stop and save this thing. I'm going to make sure I do a save as version. You can save this as a PDF. It'll probably be faster for upload. So I'm going to just make sure I got a PDF version of this. I'm going to throw it back on my desktop. Make sure you label it with your name. You can send me that. And that is the last lesson. So now that we got that taken care of, what I want to take a look at next is the first project. So congratulations, we did it. We've completed all the projects, or all the weekly assignments. Now we're going to take a look at the project. So from this point forward, we're going to be working out of this projects tab right here. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to be building an icon set. And from that icon set, you're going to be creating an infographic. So if you guys aren't familiar with an infographic, the idea of an infographic, and let me just click on this and show you kind of an example. An infographic is something that visually displays data. So what you guys are going to do is build icons that you'll be able to use in a future infographic. And the idea is that you're going to be building this around the subject of video games. And this can be any aspect of it. I just think that this is something that, like, at one point or another, everyone's got some experience with it. But also, I think visually, it's kind of a nice place to work from, because there's just so many different ways you can go with this, whether it's systems, specific games, specific platforms, like if you're really into like mobile gaming, or if you're into old school Nintendos, or you love your PS5. There's a lot of visual kind of identity that goes along well with this. So the big idea is you're going to be creating an infographic, and we're not going to actually start this for a couple of weeks. I'll leave this open. You can take a look at it as examples. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to build a custom icon set for it. So what I'm going to do first is take a look at what the requirements are. I have an example that I'm going to pull open for you guys, and then I have a little walkthrough, kind of some steps that you can follow that make this a little bit easier. So first thing, let me zoom out a little bit. Okay, so what you're going to be doing is creating 5 different video game related icons for that infographic project. Now, the icons should all relate to any aspect of gaming. Now, the reason why I introduced this as an idea first is you're going to be building graphics for a future project, so it probably makes sense for you to kind of have an idea of what you're going to talk about. So if you wanted to talk about, and again, this can be like any aspect of it. Maybe you're not a big gamer, but you understand the financial impact of it. Maybe you can talk about like how much money was spent in the App Store last year on the iOS platform on a daily basis on specific games. On educational games, all that kind of stuff. So what you're going to do is you're going to start by building out these custom icons for that specific subject. Now, if you want to sketch these things out in roughs first, you can do that. But again, I think the thing that works best for this is just being clear about what it is you're creating. Now, you should have custom shapes used. So again, you'll be using the pen tool. You want to make sure your icon is proportional. It's got a nice balance to it. You're also going to want to make sure that your icon has some sort of kind of connecting tissue to it. You want all your icons to feel like they're related somehow. I'll have a little bit more of an example in just a second. But again, you want some kind of cohesiveness as you're building this. So whether it's the shapes, whether it's a specific style, even if it's just the subject, you want to kind of maintain that. The other thing you want to think about when you're building icons is icons are incredibly simple. There should be no guessing about what it is you're seeing. They should also not include a ton of detail. You really want to make sure an icon is really, really small. So even if you take a look at like my desktop here, an icon is something that's going to show up really small. So if it scales up or down, it still is a very simple, easy to understand, easy to digest piece of information. Last part is that when you're building these things, you're going to create these in black and white. Again, whenever I'm building anything, even if it's the first draft of a logo, I want everything done in black and white first. If it has to be in color, then it's probably not going to work, but also isn't going to be super helpful in terms of multiple uses if it has to be in a certain color. So everything you build should be built in black and white. Now, there's some different kind of subject, like just general things that might work for you, or if you have a specific aspect of gaming that you want to cover, then you'll have icons that can kind of flow along with that. So I have in here that I'd like to see them as sketches, but if you're just going to build out some roughs in Illustrator, that's fine too. I'm going to kind of leave that up to you guys to decide. Remember that you're going to need a separate custom shape creator with the pen tool for each icon, that you got that balance and proportion, and then it works. It's simple, but it communicates that message. So that's the idea, and you're going to be creating 5 of these. After you're done creating 5, you're going to submit them to me, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a folder on the discussion board so that you guys can post yours and share them. So maybe you find, a couple that might work well for yours. The big idea behind this is that we're going to almost create like a library. I have some stuff that was done in the past that I'll post for you guys to be able to use as well. Now, as far as kind of process for this, I think this works really well. And I have this up here, and I'm going to kind of quick walk you through it. But I think this kind of works through the workflow of icon design, because icon design is a little bit different than logos. When we talked about logos, our brainstorming activity first before we drew anything was really like kind of combining those different elements that we could use as like visual metaphors and how we could put them together and build something out of that and create a logo for it. Icons aren't that complicated. They're really a lot more straightforward, but there is a little bit more in terms of balance and cohesiveness that we need to think about. So big things that you want to think about when you're kind of considering your icon is the structure. What is the form? What is the shape? Second thing is the character. So what are the little elements? Do we have consistency with the strokes, the fills, the colors? Just overall, do they look like they're cohesive? Because again, an icon isn't just one thing. An icon tends to be a series of things, right? And then there's an identity, and the identity is kind of that tying piece that puts it all together, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. Now, they recommend starting with a grid. I'm not necessarily worried about pixel size because this is going to be scalable anyways, right? We're in Illustrator. What I would recommend though is start with a square artboard. So if you want to go 200 pixels by 200 or 500, it doesn't matter to me. The big idea is that I want you to kind of think in terms of working in a square, because a square helps you really see balance, and you want to have an icon that's balanced, that has some nice symmetry to it. So whether you're using square, round, whatever your shapes are, you always want to kind of think of that visual weight and kind of how much area that takes. Now, if you are going to have some that are vertical or some that are horizontal, you want to think in terms of how much space within that area it's going to take. So here, this blue area, if I rotate it 90 degrees, it's taking up that same amount on my horizontal version. So if you do have different versions, you want to kind of, again, that's part of that cohesiveness thing. Diagonal layout, same basic thing. It's that shape, it's just rotating at 45 degrees, right? Now, what they recommend doing is starting with really simple shapes and then working forward from there. So nice simple geometry, nice simple angles. 45-degree angles tend to work the best because they're just real simple, and they also follow your grid really well. Then you can have nice symmetrical design. Now, whatever curves you're applying to it, remember, you want to have a nice evenness across it. The other thing you want to think about is detail. Even like these little pupils here, they're probably going to be really small if I zoom way out, right? So if I start pulling back, I lose them, and that's what I want to think of. So now if I'm looking at corners, I want to maintain nice, even consistency with it. So again, I'm going to take a look at, as I build my objects, thinking in terms of symmetry. And again, if I'm drawing this piece, I'm not going to draw it twice. I'll draw it once, copy, paste it, and reflect it onto the other side. Now, the other thing to think about is line weights. You always want to make sure you maintain even consistency with thicknesses of everything. So here, like on this, whatever stroke I'm using on these, I'm going to make sure that I maintain that same thickness of stroke for all 5 of my icons. Now, remember I talked about kind of like a cohesiveness thing? So for this one, they did this thing called the notch. They had this like little kind of cutout area under the tires, on the edge of the calendar, kind of like on the inside of the leg. That's all stuff that you can use that gives a nice consistency across the board. So you want to think about not 5 different icons that all look wildly different, but things that have kind of a similar style, a similar feel to it. And then last part is just kind of playing around with maybe any sort of unique thing to it. So here we started with like this original where our line weights didn't look the best. The curves are kind of wild. There was a little bit too much detail. When we're looking at cleaning this thing up, we're smoothing out edges. We're using consistent strokes. We're thinking about that scalability. So if I pull way back, this is very clearly a dog. Where here, even against that background, I start kind of losing some detail. So those are kind of the things that you want to think about as you're putting your logos or your icons together. So that's on there if you guys want to review it. I just think it's a little bit easier. And then as far as submitting files, again, because you're going to be sharing these things, for me, get me an Illustrator and a JPEG, and then you're going to put a JPEG and Illustrator on the discussion board. I will have the discussion board posted live within a couple days, and I'll also email you guys some of the past stuff that's been done. Now, as far as actual file setup goes, I have an example file on here. So again, this is how I built mine. I started with 5 artboards, and as I'm creating my shapes, I want to kind of create even thicknesses. So even here, like on my objects, I got some groups here. Let me throw a stroke on this. So as I'm looking, I want to kind of maintain even thicknesses so that this is the same thickness as this object here. I want to kind of maintain some consistency. Now, the other thing I talked about was kind of having those similar elements. So what I did was I did like almost like a little negative space, almost like a stroke of white around everything. So there's like little gaps. So there's gaps against the swords. There's gaps between the controller and the cord. There's gaps between the top of the headset where the mic and the kind of connecting piece are. So I use that as my element, but in the end, what I want to have are icons that have kind of a nice, consistent, cohesive feel. My boldness, my thickness, my roundness, my stroke weights, these are the things that I really want to look at so that when I'm done with all 5 of them, they feel connected. They feel like they would belong together. That makes sense? So, if you got any questions on this, again, feel free to email me, ask me, office hours, all that stuff. I'm going to be hanging out, answering questions now at the end of class here. I'm going to kill the recording. I'm going to let you guys run with this. For next week, what I'd like to see is wrapping up this lesson 13, which should only take a few minutes, pretty straightforward. And then what we'll do is next week, I'm going to do a check-in session. I'm not going to necessarily make the icons do. I want to see progress with it. But what I am going to do next week is introduce the infographic project right away so that you can take a look at kind of moving forward. If you do have questions or you want to get a little bit more into the details of how you're going to apply your icons to kind of help wrap those up, then we can kind of overlap that a little bit. So what I do want to see by the start of class next week is your progress on your icons, and that lesson 13 is wrapped up and emailed to me. Because we are now in the projects section of the class, I do want to make sure that if you have any missing work, you get that stuff wrapped up and emailed to me. You can send that over at any point. But again, check the Gradebook Center, make sure you got all that stuff wrapped up because we're getting kind of close now. We got basically about a month and change left. So if you have any questions, I'll be hanging out. Otherwise, that is what I got for you guys for this week. So thank you.